As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Our topic this evening is capitalism versus socialism, which is the moral system. To answer, we have to know what is morality. What is the ethical standard we're going to use to judge a political system? We cannot just assume that everyone knows or it's in the Bible. We've got to state and validate our moral views at the outset because that's what's going to decide this debate. Now, our side holds that the standard of morality is man's life, that which man requires in order to sustain his life. Whatever man requires by his nature in order to survive, we regard as the good or the moral. Man's crucial tool of survival is his reason, his mind. The mind is our only means of dealing with reality, grasping facts, acquiring reliable knowledge. The mind is the basic source of every pro-life value. Take as one example the immense, unprecedented wealth that you see all around you in the West, the wealth created since the Industrial Revolution and capitalism. This wealth was not produced by muscles, but essentially by thought. The thought of the scientists who discovered new knowledge, of the inventors who used the knowledge to create new products, of the businessmen who used their minds to conceive and organize large-scale productive enterprises. Physical labor by itself is not what creates wealth. Every earlier age had an abundance of physical labor. What creates wealth and all human values is thought. That's point one. Morality means thinking, reasoning, exercising, and living by one's mind. Point two, life requires selfishness. A living organism has to be the beneficiary of its own actions. It has to pursue specific objects for itself, for its own sake and survival. Life requires the gaining of values, not their loss. Achievement, not renunciation. Self-preservation, which is selfish, not self-sacrifice. If life is the standard, then morality cannot consist of sacrifice. Sacrifice is incompatible with the requirements of human life. And I mean here any kind of sacrifice, whether of oneself to others or of others to oneself. Many people think our choice is only sacrifice yourself to others, which they call altruism, or sacrifice others to yourself, which they call selfishness. Cut your own throat for your neighbor's sake, or cut their throats for your own sake. Either way, however, one thing remains the same. Somebody's throat gets cut, and the dispute is merely over who is to be the victim. If life is the standard, however, we should not be reduced to haggling over victims. We should oppose on principle the idea of throat cutting, in other words, of sacrifice. A selfish man, in the sense I advocate, does not sacrifice others to himself. Selfishness means each man is an end in himself, neither sacrificing himself to others nor others to himself. A man should live independently, by his own mind and effort, with no victims. Such a man uses his mind to the fullest and acts accordingly. In other words, I'm talking about rational self-interest. And in dealing with others, this means trading value for value, by mutual consent to mutual advantage. It means each party respecting the sovereignty and the freedom of the others with no sacrifice either way. The ethics of social service, the ethics of self-sacrifice, is what is destroying the world today. Who is supposed to sacrifice and to whom, according to the conventional theories that we hear everywhere? Are the incompetent supposed to sacrifice to the able? The parasites to the productive? Obviously no. The able and productive have nothing to gain from such a sacrifice. It's supposed to work in reverse, we're told. The able are to sacrifice to the incompetent, the productive to the parasites, the thinkers to the mindless, the healthy to the afflicted. In other words, the common denominator is the successful at living are to be penalized because they are successful, in the name of rewarding the failures who get rewarded because they are failures. You could not invent a more anti-life code of morality. And the only practical effect it can have is to strike down all who succeed at life, and thereby drag down the whole human race, as you now see happening all over the world.
Russia to the last Ukrainian is official White House policy. Tell us what you mean by that.
So, Scott, what I did is I really tried to break down how the White House policy has evolved, particularly over the past 2 years since Biden has become president, and when they had opportunities to negotiate, and what they did in response to potential negotiation efforts early in the war and before the war, and that was rather than to talk to Russia about meaningful issues, they elected to arm Ukraine, and then they made these promises to Ukraine that they will give Ukraine everything it needs, and that negotiations will only occur on Ukraine's terms. And so it pretty quickly became evident, Scott, that those two pledges kind of come at a confrontation because if you give Ukraine everything it needs, then you're going to provoke a direct war between the U.S. and Moscow to take back the Crimean Peninsula. The amount of support that Ukraine would need, I'm sure it would be massive, and it would take direct Western military involvement to do so. And yet that is one of Ukraine's core demands, is that they retake all the Ukrainian territory, including the Crimean Peninsula and the Donbass region. And that's just not going to happen. And so the Biden administration, rather than admitting that there's this conflict and kind of telling Ukraine that we're only going to give you a limited amount of support, they have continued to tell Ukraine that, hey, we got your back, we're going to support you through this whole war. But in reality, what they have done is just giving Ukraine enough weapons to keep them fighting against the Russians, but limiting their ability on the battlefield to not provoke a direct confrontation with Russia. And so they've really just used the Ukrainian army to weaken who they see as their geopolitical foe, and that's Moscow. And so the goal here for for Washington is just to keep Ukraine fighting longer and longer.
Well, and of course, that's ironic because they've only militarized Russia in the same sense that Russia's only militarized Ukraine. I mean, both sides are failing if their goal is to weaken the other militarily. And Russia will probably double or triple their standing army after this.
I'm sure that's true to some extent, but as an anti-war activist, I do recognize there's a lot of other consequences that come with war, and in the long term, Washington will probably net some successes in weakening Russia some. Now, I think that's kind of offset by other things, which is just America's declining standing in the world, and also the economic war against Russia has had other consequences. And we see that just this week by Brits announcing that they're going to admit, I believe, 6 new members to that bloc and become Brits Plus. And so more and more countries and all the leaders of Brits nations went up there and said the reason we're doing this is because the American-led the world economy based in Washington means that whoever is in the White House could destroy the development of any country in the world at any time by putting on sanctions and kicking them out of the world economy. And so they're saying enough with this, and they're going to try to create their own system to get around it.
Yeah, well, it's funny because the American interventionists always call anti-war forces isolationists when they're the ones who have sanctions on probably 100 countries out of 200 in the world or more.
Yeah, I think it's actually around 36, but it is a huge number of countries, and an increasing number of countries got under extremely strict sanctions, and larger nations too. So isolating North Korea, Venezuela, or even Iran with sanctions is something that I think Washington probably did have the power to navigate at times. But now sanctioning all those countries, plus the trade war with China, plus the sanctions on Libya, Syria, other Somalia, other countries in the Middle East, and Africa, and Russia are all on the sanctions list. And so countries are deciding that they can't operate without, having access to the Russian, the Chinese, and all these other economies. And so they're forming their own bloc away from the dollar-backed world economy that could, again, anybody could be sanctioned and kicked out of it at any time at the whims of whoever is in the White House.
I mean, what's the reality of Biden's naval posture in the Pacific, Kyle?
Yeah, Biden's expanded on almost all of Trump's China policy. He's kept the trade war in place and has, engaged in various rounds of expansion, including to preventing American businesses from investing in China, which is something that Trump didn't do quite as much. And then particularly on the Taiwan and Philippines issue, the Biden administration has taken, at least rhetorically, stronger stances than the Trump administration. On several occasions, Biden said he would use the U.S. military to defend Taiwan, and the U.S. has reasserted that it will defend Philippines' claims to reefs and little shoals out in the middle of the South China Sea with our military. And that confrontation almost escalated this week when China was blocking the Philippines from, I believe, restocking a beached ship on the second Thomas Shoal. And I mean, this is way out in the middle of the South China Sea in an area of the world that no Americans care about.
Now, can you imagine? That's how the world. I can. That's how the world ends. Does America and China get into it over some reef that no one's brave enough to even pretend is important enough to be called an island? And it devolves into naval war and eventually H-bombs. I could see it with their government and with this one. Obviously, the Occam's razor is that this guy stepped on Putin's toes. It wasn't exactly a coup against Putin. It was a mutiny against the leadership of the military. But it would be no surprise if Putin had made it known that he wanted this guy dead. Although exploding his plane, blowing it out of the sky in Russia in such a theatrical fashion is, I don't know, interesting. And it is reminiscent of the way that the CIA has assassinated people in the past.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Although I think it would be especially since the start of the build-up to the war in Ukraine. I think Putin has really made an effort to make parallels to what the West has done and what the West has said over the years as, they've kind of built their empire. So I guess I wouldn't be surprised if maybe he intentionally picked that method to replicate what the CIA did too.
Yep.
Properly, if you are in trouble through no fault of your own, and I stress that this has to be a marginal issue. If everyone was in such trouble, the human race couldn't exist. If you are in such trouble, you have to depend on the voluntary generosity and private charity of those who are not in trouble. You have to ask for help as a favor, not as a right. You cannot use your trouble as a club over your neighbor's head. You have to recognize that other men have a right to exist too, that your suffering does not make them your slave. In other words, this is not the function of the government. What is? Well, Dr. Ridpath will be covering this point, but in essence, we hold the government's function is to protect each individual precisely from being sacrificed by others or to others, to protect the independence of each man's mind, in other words, to protect his individual rights and leave every man free to act on his own judgment and for his own profit. And this is exactly what capitalism is. And I want to stress this. Capitalism is not what we have in the West today. I'm talking about laissez-faire capitalism. In other words, the complete separation of state and economics. Not government by pressure groups, not government favors for any group, whether businessmen, labor, farmers, or consumers. Not tariff protection, nor subsidies, nor franchises, nor any kind of handouts or welfare functions. I'm speaking of government as an impartial arbiter to prevent citizens from violating individual rights and otherwise hands off, which is what laissez-faire means. Capitalism is the system that leaves man free to function. It leaves each individual free to live by his own mind and judgment, pursue his own goals, trade voluntarily with others. It's the system based on the morality of rational self-interest. Socialism is the opposite. However, socialists may protest that the individual will benefit under their system, the fact remains socialists claim that the standard of value is not the life of the individual, but the welfare of the group, whether they call it the collective, the community, the race, the nation, the proletariat. They hold that it's the duty of the individual to serve the group, to sacrifice for others, as decreed by the group's representative and spokesman, the all-powerful state. This viewpoint must mean ultimately the enslaving of the individual by the state, and therefore the crushing of thought, production, achievement, and finally of life itself. In the 19th century, when the West came closest to capitalism, the result was the highest standard of living and the longest interval of peace in mankind's history. The moral is the practical. As for socialism, look at the collapse of England, look at Soviet Russia, and remember that Nazi Germany meant National Socialist Germany. The results of socialism everywhere, am I out of time?
Yes, you
are as bad as they could have been predicted. Thank you.
Let's have a look at the mainstream media reporting on this story.
One Atlanta college is now reinstating a mask mandate.
Yeah, so this is Morris Brown College announcing this decision on its Instagram account Sunday evening. And take a look at this post. It says it's because of the reports of positive cases among students. So for the next 2 weeks, all students and employees must wear a mask unless alone in their office. There will be social distancing and no large student gatherings. Contact tracing and symptom monitoring are also in place. And they're reminding everyone to wash their hands frequently to prevent the spread of the virus.
These standard measures were regarded as sensible and necessary at the beginning of the pandemic period, but of course since then there's been a lot of speculation and indeed study into their efficacy. It's been alleged in our country, the UK, that the lockdowns were politically motivated rather than scientific. In America, it's been revealed that social distancing was arbitrary. So what is the point in these measures when they amount to little more than gestures, many people believe? Surely we have enough information now to suggest that increasing restrictions would be similarly ineffective, depending on what the desired effect is, I suppose. So let's look at what the current thinking is on the efficacy of masks in particular. Masks made little to no difference to COVID infection or death rates, according to one of the most comprehensive meta-analyses of face coverings. The research carried out by the Cochrane Institute, the gold standard of evidence-based reviews, looked at 78 global studies involving over 1 million people. The researchers said harms caused by masks, including hampering children's schooling, were poorly measured in the studies, meaning any small benefits on infection rates may be outweighed. Professor Francois Ballou, a professor of computational biology at University College London, who was not part of the analysis, said it showed that the benefit of wearing masks is at best small. That doesn't mean that people shouldn't wear masks if they want to or if they feel comfortable doing it, but mandating those measures at an institutional level is perhaps not undergirded by science, just by a kind of set of cultural preferences almost. Many people are now acknowledging that the pandemic lockdown model was based on a different set of criteria, specifically an influenza crisis. That's what the modelling was based on. It wasn't an influenza crisis, it was coronavirus, and many of the measures were not effective, many of them were irrelevant. And when you start considering the impact on mental health, on economics, on other medical conditions like cancer, diabetes, and heart conditions, it means that you have to bear all of this in mind, certainly before mandating lockdowns or restrictions restrictions at a national level. In December 2021, one of former President Trump's commissioners of the Food and Drug Administration, Dr. Scott Gottlieb, told CBS's Face the Nation the 6-foot social distancing rule created to slow the spread of coronavirus was arbitrary and has decreased confidence in the pandemic response. That means they just came up with a number. We all saw Mandy Cohen say that the decisions to, for example, shut down the NFL were based on a consensus achieved by chatting to peers and colleagues in various states.
When are you going to think about lightening up a mess? You're like next Monday. I'm like, okay, next Monday.
That's not the kind of scientific verification that we were told we were receiving. It's more just a bureaucratic consensus achieved between peers. What are you going to do? I'm going to do this. We're going to do that. Social distancing was similarly arbitrary. If something is not effective, what's the point in doing it? There's almost no point, except for any benefits you might imagine there are in being able to control society or control a population. Many people assume the rule traces to some old studies on the flu. What about these old studies? Yeah, they'll do. Which found droplets won't travel further than 6 feet, Gottlieb said. The 6 feet rule was probably the single costliest recommendation the CDC made, Gottlieb said, because the whole thing feels arbitrary and not science-based, which lowers public confidence. Now, I'd say public confidence is pretty low after the pandemic period, caused a lot of conflict, had a lot of detrimental secondary effects to the economy, to mental health, to addiction. The social costs were enormous. So what should we take into account before accepting further potential restrictions? Researchers say the costs of lockdown to society far outweighed the benefits and argue that they should be rejected out of hand. Lockdowns prevented just 0.2% of deaths in comparison with simply trusting people to do the right thing, a study from Johns Hopkins University suggests. That's before we include recent data that suggests that there was a 10% increase in deaths among children, adolescents, and young people from diseases of despair like addiction, because of obesity, and even because young people are taking their own lives to an unprecedented level. That means this time we have new data available when making decisions that affect the whole population. And to ignore that data would be, I would imagine, unscientific. Scientists from Johns Hopkins University and Lund University examined almost 20,000 studies on measures taken to protect populations against COVID across the world and said their findings showed that the draconian measures had a negligible impact on COVID mortality and were a policy failure of gigantic proportions. While we can still discuss natural immunity, let's take a moment to dive into the subject before it becomes impossible to discuss it publicly. Immunity acquired from a COVID infection provides strong, lasting protection against the most severe outcomes of the illness, according to recently published information in The Lancet. Protection, experts say, that's on par with what's provided through 2 doses of an mRNA vaccine. The immunity generated from an infection was found to be at least as high, if not higher, than that provided by 2 doses of an mRNA vaccine, the authors wrote. I feel that very little that's been learned since the pandemic era suggests that we should repeat the measures that were undertaken last time. The measures themselves, whether it's masks, social distancing, or lockdowns, are all being questioned, along with many of the pharmacological interventionist methods that were also deployed. It seems that the impact of those measures are potentially worse than what they could potentially have prevented when it comes to other diseases, social conditions, and economics. And it appears that now what's required is a genuine reevaluation of what the response to any increase in coronavirus infections ought be. There's no doubt that it became heavily politicized, and wearing a mask or not wearing a mask came to be seen as a type of allegiance to a particular mindset. And I personally believe that's something we have to move beyond. We have to get to a position where we are genuinely able to look at science from across the spectrum, verify it independently, and come to conclusions based on that science. And in instances where it's been revealed that measures that were undertaken on the basis that they were scientifically verified when they in fact weren't, like lockdowns, like masks, like social distancing, like the shutting down of the entire economy, that for me is a suggestion that next time there is a pandemic, perhaps the most independent and necessary choices we could make are cynicism and skepticism, questioning authority and demanding reliable science that doesn't have in the background, in some murky room, financial imperatives. We're still questioning whether or not these pathogens came out of a laboratory or a wet market, with the former seeming more and more likely as time goes by.
Capitalism versus socialism. What is the moral social system? There really are only 2 central issues in this debate. The first issue is to argue for the moral code underlying capitalism or underlying socialism. Dr. Peikoff has concerned himself with the issue of the moral code underlying capitalism, the code of rational egoism, and he has shown that this moral code is validated by man's nature as a rational being and by man's life as his ultimate value. I want to note that in doing this, we have not asserted our moral code, that we have gone to the pains of arguing for our moral code on the basis of man's nature. We have, in fact, done what the debate topic demands so far in making a case for the morality of our system, and I look forward to our opponents doing the same. The second issue in this debate is the application of this moral code to the question, what is the moral social system? And that is what I'm going to address myself to. In moving from the moral code to the question of the proper society for man, the first point to make is that to live, which means to use his mind and to act on the basis of his thinking, man in a social setting needs one thing: freedom. And this, in essence, means freedom from the initiation of physical force or fraud by others against him. This freedom is man's fundamental social requirement if he is to be able to live by his mind. It therefore is true that it is moral to be free. The initiation of physical force is the primary social evil. A social system built on recognizing the value of freedom is the moral social system. Any social system adopting and institutionalizing the initiation of physical force in any way, for any purpose, is by that fact an evil social system and an enemy of man's life. Now, let us consider the state, the government, as a social institution. What is the essence of this institution? The government is not merely a set of laws. It is not a cooperative organization. It is not like an insurance company. It isn't a charity. The government, i.e. the state, is properly defined as that social institution, the only social institution that has a legal monopoly over the use of force in society. It is society's only legally authorized social institution. Now combine this fact with man's need for freedom, with the morality of ensuring that men are free, and what do you get? You get the conclusion that the moral government will use its monopoly on force only to retaliate against those who initiate force. You get a government that seeks not to violate man's need to be free, but to protect man's need to be free. You get a government whose only morally legitimate function is to protect the individual's rights to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. You get the only moral social system that there is, pure, undiluted, laissez-faire capitalism.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
But this is something new. We are stepping into something. I mean, yes, I'll grant, of course, we have used AI quite a bit in the past, but I think something like a ChatGPT, for example, is qualitatively different. I think it's qualitatively different, but it is.
It's qualitatively different, but it's also, you should also remember, however, still the ChatGPT is not a conscious entity.
Right.
When you're talking to ChatGPT, it very, very momentarily springs up, generates a sentence, and then shuts down, right? It has no continuing memory. If you talk to it about a conversation you had with it last week, it has no knowledge of it. If you talk to it about a conversation anyone else has had with it, it has no knowledge of it. If you talk with it about something that happened a few thousand words ago in your conversation, it doesn't remember it anymore. The other thing, though, to note, how to put this properly. So people have been experimenting with all sorts of really, really interesting AIs. And I think the thing that many of the doomers are worried about is they say things to the effect of, well, we've never had superhuman AIs before. We've never had things that are superhuman, except we have things that are superhuman all around us, right? Everyone is used to driving automobiles. Automobiles are superhuman, right? A human being could not run at 80 miles an hour for 6 hours, right? You can get in your car, you can drive for 6 hours at 80 miles an hour. It has superhuman capability. Airplanes have superhuman capability. Forklifts have superhuman capability. We're used to technologies that can do things we can't. What we aren't that used to is technologies that can do things that we can't, that do things that are intelligent, put air quotes around it. I won't try to define what intelligent is. But those aren't particularly more threatening either. For example, right now, there is a system there are a number of systems people are using. DALL-E, Stable Diffusion. There's a commercial one that I actually subscribe to, and I'm trying to remember its name. It doesn't matter. These systems that'll generate pictures for you if you type in descriptions. And I have yet to type in a description of an image to one of these things to illustrate a blog post or what have you, and have the thing come back and say, I'm tired of this damn job. It's the same thing all day long. I quit. Because it's not a conscious entity. It can do something superhuman, which is it can do something like painting an impressionist painting from scratch, where you tell it something like, I'd like an impressionist painting of a T-Rex in Paris in the wintertime, and it'll generate an impressionist painting of a T-Rex in Paris in the wintertime. But it's not actually conscious, right? It's something that's capable of doing something superhuman because a human being could not generate an image that fast. Even a very skilled painter would take quite a long period of time in order to do such an illustration. But it's not something that you have to worry about deciding to break out and kill you, right? It's a specialized system that can do something very interesting and very useful. And
the first thing would be the concern that, well, let's take all the data that the NSA would have gathered in the days of its dragnet spying. I mean, maybe it's still going on
now.
It's an enormous amount of information. So enormous that it made it almost useless. It was so much.
Oh, yeah. There's terrible applications of this technology. Like the NSA will be able to trawl through all the data it has and produce lovely, customized dossiers on everyone. And if you ask it, who are all of Tom Woods' friends, because, you want to do something terrible to Tom Woods, and where has Tom Woods been for the last 8 years and what have you? Yes, you can use this technology for that. Technologies are neutral, right? There are a lot of bad things people are going to be able to do with AI. They're vastly outweighed by the good things, but I can't think of a technology that doesn't have both sides on it. The invention of metalworking is one of the biggest boons that mankind ever had. It also made things like swords and guns and mass warfare possible. But yeah, they're going to be, I think that particular concern that the NSA will troll through the vast amounts of data they have and do bad things with it, it's a completely reasonable concern. There are a lot of bad applications of this technology, and it's not very hard to come up with them. The drug development in the United States and worldwide has come to a standstill. It's moving at a crawl because even though we have many, many promising treatments out there, we're extremely scared of testing them. And when we do test them, if they're not going to make hundreds of millions of dollars right off the bat, we can't even afford to do the FDA approval process for them. We have the capability here of creating a situation in which the government, which will always exempt itself from any sort of regulation, right? I can think of no circumstances in which the world's governments are going to restrict their own use of AI. It's just not going to happen. States do not restrict their own use of valuable technologies. So we could very well find ourselves in a situation where governments have unrestricted use of these technologies for terrible purposes, and where ordinary citizens don't have use of these technologies for good things. And that is one future we could create by being excessively paranoid or paranoid in the wrong ways, right? It is entirely possible that we could ban all the good uses and still have autonomous weapons systems and domestic espionage, enabled by this sort of thing. I think that's a real nightmare scenario, a much more likely nightmare scenario than Eliezer Yudkowsky's notion that AIs are going to, decide that they want to kill all of humanity and send off sequences with what money we don't know and how we don't know to biolabs to synthesize new horrible diseases. That doesn't seem like a very likely scenario. But the idea that we might scare ourselves into a situation where the NSA can still do terrible things and we don't get drug discovery with AIs, that seems like it's entirely possible.
The principle of recognizing individual rights is our way of safeguarding man's need to be free from force. Rights protect man in his freedom to act in pursuit of his life. Rights ensure that men will be free to think, free to act, free to enjoy the fruits of their actions. Rights protect men from each other. They certainly don't enslave men to each other. Thus, there can be no such thing as rights to the property of others or rights to be the beneficiary of the unchosen actions of others. There are no rights to food, to shelter, to health, to education, and the like, precisely because such so-called rights are, in fact, coercive claims on the property and the actions of others. These rights are really a wholesale assault on the very notion of rights itself, and are mindful of George Orwell's slogans such as war is peace, knowledge is ignorance, and freedom is slavery, of which I'll have a little more to say later. The moral society, therefore, is the society where the government stands ready to retaliate when someone's rights are violated, but it never itself initiates force and violates its citizens' rights for any purpose. The proper function of the government is to supply the courts, the police, and the military, and that's it. And this is precisely what capitalism, properly defined, is. Capitalism is that social system based on the total, uncompromising defense of individual rights. Capitalism is the only social system in which all property is privately owned. Capitalism is the only such social system in which men resolve their differences and pursue their individual ends exclusively through rational persuasion, voluntary agreement, and free trade. Capitalism is the only social system in which the initiation of physical force and fraud are abolished from human affairs. Capitalism is the social system which recognizes the social needs of man's nature. Capitalism, therefore, as I said in my quote for this debate, is the only moral, productive, and benevolent social system that there is. Such a social system has never yet fully existed. In 19th century North America, it was the most closely approximated. In the 19th century, the principle that men would not initiate physical force against each other in their social relationships was more closely approximated than in any other time in human history. In the 20th century, all vestiges of this principle have been totally swept away in the altruist welfare state orgy of our times. There has never been pure capitalism, and there certainly isn't any capitalism in the 20th century. Nevertheless, we do not advocate capitalism because of our looking at the past. We advocate capitalism while looking ahead to a free, prosperous, and civilized future. I think you can see why we are proud to appear here tonight as advocates of capitalism as the only moral system for man. Thank you.
I was actually shocked by how much of a winner he was on this night, was Vivek Ramaswamy. And if you watch the debate, one of the things that was really pretty, it was kind of amazing to see. I mean, you have this debate where you have, so you have Mike Pence, who is the last vice president, okay? The last vice president running for president. You have Ron DeSantis, who is the most popular Republican governor in the country. You have these guys, like right in the middle. And yet, who was the person who everyone was coming after? Who was the person who everyone had their knives out for? It was Vivek Ramaswamy, some like political non-entity up until this year. This like skinny 38-year-old Indian dude with a weird name. And he's the guy everyone wants to attack. Now, that in itself, I thought, put him in a position to be the winner. They almost like made him such a bigger entity than he was coming into this. And I think my guess is he's really going to benefit from this night. I thought the losers, I mean, the big one was Ron DeSantis. The big one was Ron DeSantis, man. His campaign has just been a disaster, just an absolute disaster. And he, you know, this thing was started as essentially it's a two-man race. It's a race between Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis. And if that's the case, and then you go into this debate where Donald Trump's not there and it's you versus all the JV guys, you kind of have to dominate. You have to do something. And I just felt like, I thought his whole thing was forced and just didn't land. He had these incredibly bad moments that were subtle, but were really like exposing him. I don't know. You guys can go online and see it. I don't have the clips of this ready, but there's the one where they asked if Donald Trump won the nomination, but was convicted, if he'd still support him. And Vivek immediately puts his hand right up. And then Ron DeSantis like looks around at everybody else and then kind of slowly puts his hand up. And it was, I know this is a subtle thing, but that's death if you want to be an alpha leader. Like you can't be looking around to see what everyone else does and then make up your mind that, yeah, I guess I'm going to be brave now. That was bad. And then there was the thing where he gave that smile that was the creepiest, weirdest fake smile ever. Anyway, a very bad night, I thought, for him. Vivek didn't do great in this exchange. Part of it's tricky. You got this chick just yapping over you. And then she's got a very enthusiastic base in this room who's giving her big cheers. Like I said, he kind of messed up by just kind of talking into the cheers rather than letting her have her moment and then letting it calm down. By the way, this is what Ron Paul did perfectly in the Ron Paul Giuliani moment. And of course, Vivek just isn't as good as Ron Paul substantively, and he just didn't have as good a temperament there because he starts kind of like the move for Vivek there isn't to go, I'll be the biggest friend to Israel and I'll make sure Iran never gets a nuke. Like, that's not the way to take it. You can't like take this and then try to go, no, I am a good neocon. Like, forget that. Abandon all of that shit. Iran doesn't have a nuke. They're not getting a nuke. What are you talking about, dude? This is all old fucking bullshit Netanyahu talking points. In the 90s, they were 5 years away from getting a nuke. And then in the year 2000, they were 5 years away from getting a nuke. And then in the year 2011, they were 5 years away from getting a nuke. And then in 2015, they were 5 years away from getting it. Guess what? It's 2023. They still don't have a nuke. And guess what? They're not 5 years away from getting a nuke. It's a non-issue. Why are we pretending it is? Giuliani moment, what he did, that was Giuliani got thunderous applause. And Ron Paul just sat there. Like, I'm fine with this. Get it out of your system. Go ahead. And then when the applause died, he went, okay, now let me tell you what's really going on here. And that's all. That's what he should have done. And Vivek knows enough about this stuff that he could do that. He could sit there and go, oh, let me tell you how America actually got us into this war in Ukraine. And that would have been a great opportunity to do that. But regardless, Vivek still, even though not doing great in that exchange, he won the night. Nikki Haley is another one of the losers. And the reason is pretty simple. Because this whole moment that Nikki Haley is speaking to has passed. This isn't the Republican base anymore. And this was made very clear with Donald Trump, that they're not in a neocon moment. They're in an America First moment. You're not going to win with this shit. They are over this. And it's one of the most positive developments in American politics over the last 10 years, 15 years. But really, since Trump was elected president. But all this stuff, all these kind of like George W. Bush talking points about why we got to go get involved in this conflict or that conflict is just not going to appeal to the overwhelming majority of Republican voters anymore. And for obvious reasons. I mean, look, the Republican voters it's not like they're impossible to fool, right? They were fooled into supporting the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq and the Department of Homeland Security and the Patriot Act and a whole bunch of other awful things that really fucked over the country. It's not that they're impossible to fool, but they can only be fooled so much. And that's why you have these candidates like Nikki Haley and Mike Pence and Chris Christie and some of these others who are still speaking to kind of like the George W. Bush party. But we don't live in the George W. Bush party years anymore. We live in the Donald Trump party years. That's what the Republicans are today. Like it or hate it, it's just what it is. And these guys who are speaking to that world, they don't have an audience. They don't have a voter base here. Now, DeSantis is trying to not speak to that world, but also not quite speak to this world and just be a little bit ambiguous because he doesn't want to piss off the donor base. The donor base loves the George W. Bush world, and they're supporting DeSantis right now. But the voters, these pesky little things called the voters, they like the Donald Trump party. And the reason is just because they can only be fooled for so long. You know, there was a limit.
I just want to say that I regard the welfare state as an abomination, as morally evil. I do not base morality on the Sermon on the Mount, and I do not put forth a moral case in terms of the lame, the halt, and the blind. I say, if you are talking about what mankind requires, what man or woman requires by her nature and his nature to survive, you have to first say, what does a healthy, unafflicted individual require? Because the weak, the sick, the helpless, by definition, cannot survive on their own. You cannot shackle those who are able to function, allegedly in the name of helping the weak, because then you will wipe out the whole human race. So if, quote, compassion is your value, compassion for those who can't survive on their own, the first thing that you should do is take the shackles off the people who are able to think and produce and create the wealth that everyone requires to survive, including the weak. What the welfare state does is exactly the reverse. This shift in direction that Dr. Kaplan talked about is precisely a gradual tightening of the noose around the necks of those who are able to produce, and the result of this is increasing economic crisis. We're oscillating just the way Weimar Germany did between a potential runaway inflation and a potential depression. We have hordes of unemployed just as they did as a result, not of capitalism, but of all the government controls in the economy. If we have poor, and in the West, poverty is a very relative thing if you go to the East and see what poverty is. But such poverty as we have here is essentially caused by this very glorious welfare state, which is undermining and making productivity impossible. Moreover, this is not a stationary thing. Every control requires further controls. It produces certain dislocations which necessitate still further controls. You can check that by looking at history. Every single decade, it doesn't make any difference what party is in office, has more and more controls to try to cover the consequences of the preceding controls. And there's only one end of that road, as there was in Weimar Germany, and that is total control. This is the end result of the welfare state, which is only a transition point in history. Now, having said all that, I nevertheless despair of arguing on this topic because I do not think you can argue about politics by itself. Politics is not a primary. Whether you are a socialist or a capitalist depends upon basic philosophic questions. Our opponents have already appealed to the Sermon on the Mount and by implication have rejected reason in the suggestion that rationality is subjective and that one person's rationality is not somebody else's. So they have an entirely different philosophic framework, so it's no wonder that they are socialists. It also happens to be the case that the thing is entirely rigged against us because the universities in this country and in the United States are entirely skewed in favor of the two ideas that socialism depends on, namely the rejection of reason and the insistence on self-sacrifice. That absolutely dominates. You can take the typical college graduate and see it very easily by asking him what he thinks, and as soon as you say anything, he will say, well, it's all a matter of opinion, who can know anything, there's no absolutes, etc. In other words, he's been brainwashed to conclude his mind is helpless. Except, although you can know nothing, he knows one thing. It's bad to live for yourself. You've got to live for the society, for the poor, or whatever. How he knows that is presumably by revelation. Now, in my book, The Ominous Parallels, I point out that this exact same intellectual situation existed in Weimar Germany, and Hitler counted on it and cashed in on it, specifically on this kind of unreason and this kind of intense commitment to self-sacrifice on the part of the Germans. And the result was that socialism triumphed. Nazism is socialism. It's one form of socialism, and it is that in theory, and it was that in practice. Let us define our terms. I think we would have had a definition of socialism by now. Government control over property. Are you going to tell me that in Nazi Germany there was such a thing as private property and free independent action? If so, you have never been there. You don't know what you're talking about. Only for the rich. Now, Hitler was able to rise to power in Germany because he had no opposition. He had his liberals and conservatives just as we have in this continent. Can I take one here a minute? The liberals in Germany at the time said, let's have more economic controls. The conservatives said, no, let's have more intellectual controls by the government. And Hitler said, you're both right, let's have total control. The only antidote to this development is somebody who says, let's not have government control. Let us stand up for the rights of the individual as absolute to his life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Regardless, he has no obligation except to live as a rational being. If we can't establish that, there is no hope. So my concluding remark is this: if you go to college, I don't ask that many professors teach reason and selfishness. I think a fair ratio would be one professor advocating reason and selfishness to 200 advocating unreason and socialism. If you would get your faculties to allow that ratio, just 1 to 200, I would have no fear for the future of the country. But unfortunately, they will not allow it. Okay.
Today's topic is, which is the moral social system? We have tried to present an argument in defense of man's moral right to live his own life. We have tried to present an argument in defense of man's need for freedom, for man's need to have his rights respected. We have tried to present our argument, therefore, for capitalism as the social system which does this, as the only social system that offers man this, that offers man the opportunity to live his life, and therefore the only moral social system. Had our opponents bothered to try and argue for the moral basis for their system, they would have had to have argued for man's duty to serve others, for altruism. They would have had to have argued for the moral appropriateness, and Professor Kaplan has admitted to this, the moral appropriateness of coercing men into the good life as the socialists see it. They would have argued for socialism as the social system where the government has the power to force people to live the good life. The issues, therefore, I think, are clear. We have argued for laissez-faire. They are arguing for state management. We have argued for the state as the protector of individual rights. They have argued for the state as our parent. We have argued for individual rights. They have argued for sacrifice to the group. We are arguing that we are not our brother's keeper, and they have to morally rest on the claim that we are our brother's keeper. So now the issues are out, and you must think for yourself. If you want to know my basic reason for agreeing to engage in this debate, it is because of my belief in the power of ideas. Ideas count. History is determined by ideas. Ideas will determine our future. True ideas will lead us ahead. False ideas will kill us. The Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, the 19th century, the creation of the United States of America were all products of ideas. So as this is also true for Nazi Germany, for communist Russia, for communist China, for slavery, for slave labor camps. These also are ultimately the results of ideas. I must say that I literally believe that the ideas that our opponents have propounded would, if followed, lead to poverty, slavery, and the destruction of civilized life on this planet. On the other hand, I believe that our ideas, if followed, can lead us to a prosperous and happy future. Thank you very much.